The condensation on the crystal water glass felt like ice against Elara's palms. Across the candle-lit table at L'Ermitage, Mark was checking his reflection in the polished blade of his steak knife. He looked every bit the rising tech mogul, sharp jawline, a suit that cost more than their first 3 months of rent combined, and eyes that were already scanning the room for someone more important than the woman sitting across from him. "Mark," Elara said, her voice soft, carrying the warmth of 5 years of shared morning coffees and late-night pep talks. "I have something to tell you, something about the merger you've been worried about." She reached into her purse, her fingers brushing the heavy gold seal of Vance Global. She was done hiding. She had spent half a decade playing the role of the supportive girlfriend, working a quiet administrative job while funneling her private insights and her family's anonymous connections into his struggling firm, Sterling Tech. She wanted to tell him that she was the daughter of the Vance empire, that today she was ready to bridge their worlds. Mark didn't look up. He took a slow sip of a vintage Cabernet. "Actually, Elara, I should go first. This is an anniversary after all." Elara smiled, a flicker of hope warming her chest. "Okay, you first." "I'm moving on," he said. The words were flat, devoid of the heat they'd shared just weeks ago. Elara's smile faltered. "Moving? To the San Francisco office? Mark, I can come with." "No," he interrupted, finally meeting her eyes. There was no love there, only a cold, calculated ambition. "I'm moving on from us. I've reached a level, Elara, where the scenery has changed. You've been wonderful, truly. You were the perfect person to have by my side when I was building the foundation. But I'm building a skyscraper now, and you're a cottage in the woods." The air in the restaurant suddenly felt thin. The ambient noise, the clinking of silverware, the low hum of jazz, faded into a dull roar in her ears. "A cottage?" she whispered. "You're sweet, Elara, but you're stagnant. You have no drive, no pedigree. I need a partner who matches my trajectory, someone who can walk into a boardroom and command it." He leaned back, glancing toward the entrance. Following his gaze, Elara saw a woman approaching. She was draped in silk the color of champagne, her blonde hair styled in waves that looked like they belonged on a currency note. "This is Tiffany Thorne," said Mark, his voice regaining his practiced charisma. "Her father is on my board. We're engaged." "Engaged?" Elara felt the word shatter in her mouth. "Mark, we lived together this morning. I paid the lease on the penthouse this month." "And I'll have your things sent to your sister's place by tomorrow," said Mark, standing up to pull out a chair for Tiffany. Tiffany didn't even look at Elara. She looked through her, as if she were a smudge on a window. "Don't make a scene, Elara," said Mark, leaning down. "It's beneath you. Just go quietly. It's the one thing you're good at." Elara stumbled out of the restaurant, the humid night air hitting her like a physical blow. Her hands shaking so hard she couldn't fit the key into the ignition. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was a text from the building manager. "Mr. Sterling has requested a lock change for Unit 402. Your belongings have been moved to the loading dock for pickup." A sob escaped her, jagged and raw. She was 30 years old, homeless, and discarded like an obsolete piece of software by the man she had built a life for. Then the phone rang. The caller ID read, "Arthur Henderson, legal." She wiped her eyes, her voice trembling. "Hello?" "Elara, it's done." The voice on the other end was grave but respectful. "Your father signed the final papers an hour ago before boarding his flight to the Maldives. The transition is complete. As of 6 p.m. tonight, you are the sole chairwoman and majority shareholder of the Apex Group." Elara stared at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her mascara was smudged, her eyes red, but behind the tears, a spark of something cold and sharp began to ignite. "The Apex Group," Elara repeated. That means I own the Thorne Estate Holdings, doesn't it? Correct. And, per the acquisition we finalized this afternoon, you are now the parent owner of Sterling Tech. Mark Sterling is, technically, your employee. How would you like to proceed with the announcement? Elara looked back at the glowing sign of the restaurant. She saw Mark and Tiffany through the glass, laughing over a bottle of wine she likely paid for. Don't announce it yet, Elara said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming steady and terrifyingly calm. I want to see the skyscraper he's building from the inside. Prepare the paperwork for a senior consultant role. I'm going into Sterling on Monday. I want to see exactly what I've bought. On Monday morning, the lobby of Sterling Tech felt different. To anyone else, it was the same glass and steel cathedral dedicated to Mark's ego, but to Elara, it was now an asset on a balance sheet. She stood before the full-length mirror in her new apartment, a temporary but palatial suite overlooking the city, and adjusted the lapel of her charcoal gray power suit. Gone were the soft floral prints and the oversized cardigans she wore to make herself seem smaller and less intimidating for Mark. Her hair, usually tied in a messy, practical bun, was now a sleek, polished curtain that caught the light. She looked like a woman who could buy and sell the building, because she was. Remember, she whispered to her reflection, you aren't here for revenge. You're here for an audit. When she stepped through the glass doors of Sterling Tech, the receptionist, Sarah, looked up and froze. Sarah had seen Elara dozens of times, usually carrying bags of takeout from Mark's late-night sessions or waiting quietly in the corner of the lobby. "Elara?" Sarah stammered. I was told you weren't allowed." "I'm here for the 9 a.m. briefing with the executive team," Elara said, sliding a sleek black security badge across the marble counter. It didn't have the Sterling Tech logo. It bore the embossed gold triangle of the Apex Group. Sarah's eyes widened. "The parent company? You're the senior consultant?" "Elara Vance," she confirmed, with a polite, razor-sharp smile. "And I believe I'm expected." The conference room was buzzing. Mark was at the head of the table, leaning back with his hands behind his head, laughing at something Tiffany Thorne was saying. Tiffany was draped over the chair next to him, looking bored and expensive. The door opened, and the room went silent. Mark's chair hit the floor with a loud thud. "Elara? What the hell are you doing here? I told the building manager to—" "Mr. Sterling," Elara interrupted, her voice cool and professional. She walked to the opposite end of the table and set her leather portfolio down. "Your new owners have concerns about the recent stagnation in your skyscraper project. I've been sent to oversee the transition and ensure the assets are being managed appropriately." Mark's face turned a mottled shade of purple. "This is a joke, some kind of pathetic attempt to get back at me? You, a consultant? You were an admin assistant at a library before I took you in." Tiffany let out a sharp, melodic laugh. "Darling, did you steal that badge, or did you sleep with someone at Apex to get a pity job?" Elara didn't flinch. She opened her portfolio and pulled out a stack of documents. "I have the signed authorization from Arthur Henderson, Chief Legal Counsel of Apex. If you have questions about my credentials, Mark, you can take them up with him. Or we can discuss why your Q3 projections are off by 15%. Mark looked at the papers, his jaw twitching. He couldn't fire her, not if she represented the hand that held his leash. He narrowed his eyes, a cruel smirk slowly forming. "Fine, you want to play professional? Let's play. But don't think you're getting a private office. You can sit in the drafting pit with the architects. They're behind schedule anyway."
The drafting pit was a frantic, low-light basement level filled with blueprints and stressed-out designers. It was meant to be a humiliation. Elara didn't complain. She gathered her things and headed down. The pit was a maze of monitors and rolled-up vellum. At the center desk sat a man with rolled-up sleeves and dark, messy hair that looked like he'd been running his hands through it all night. He didn't look up as she approached. "If you're here to tell me the loading bearing specs for the Sterling Tower are due by 5, save your breath," he muttered, his eyes fixed on a 3D model. "Gravity doesn't work on a deadline." "I'm actually here to help you fix the structural integrity of the West Wing," Elara said, leaning over to look at his screen. "If you keep the cantilever at that angle without a reinforced core, the whole thing will sag within 5 years. It's a vanity design, not a functional one." The man finally looked up. His eyes were a startling, observant gray. He looked at Elara, really looked at her, not at her suit or her badge, but at the logic in her eyes. "Finally," he breathed, a small, genuine smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Someone who actually understands physics instead of just aesthetic. I'm Liam Hayes, lead architect and resident scapegoat." "Elara Vance," she said, offering her hand. Liam took it. His grip was firm and warm, lacking the oily calculation of Mark's touch. "Well, Elara, welcome to the trenches. Mark usually sends people down here to die professionally. What did you do to piss him off?" "I let him think I was a cottage, when I'm actually the land he's building on." Liam chuckled, a deep, resonant sound. "I like that. Well, land, grab a stool. We've got a skyscraper to save and about 4 hours before Mark tries to throw us both under the bus." As they worked through the afternoon, Elara felt a sensation she hadn't felt in years: respect. Liam didn't talk down to her. He listened to her ideas, challenged her logic, and treated her like an equal. But from the glass mezzanine above, Mark was watching. He leaned against the railing, his arm around Tiffany, a dark scowl on his face. "She thinks she's someone now," Tiffany hissed, sipping a latte. "We need to remind her exactly where she belongs, Mark, before she gets too comfortable in our building." Mark nodded slowly. "Don't worry. The Apex Gala is in 3 days. I'll make sure she's not just removed from the company, but blacklisted from the industry. She wants to play a player. I'll show you what happens when you play out of your league."
The drafting pit was a sanctuary of ink and ethics, but the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a shark tank filled with silk. Elara stood before the mirror in the hotel's private suite, smoothed the fabric of her gown, a deep, midnight emerald silk that draped like liquid moonlight, and took a steadying breath. This wasn't just a party, it was the Apex Group's annual investor gala. Tonight, the hierarchy of the city would be reshuffled, though most of the players didn't know it yet. A knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find Liam. He wasn't in a tuxedo. He wore a well-fitted black suit that looked like it had seen a few weddings, but he carried it with a rugged, easy grace. He held a single white camellia. "I know I'm just the guy who calculates the wind loads," Liam said, his voice dropping an octave as his eyes traveled over her. "But you look, Elara, you look like the person this building was built for." "Thank you, Liam." She tucked the flower into her clutch, her heart doing a strange, frantic dance. "Are you ready to face the lion's den?" she asked. "As long as you're the one holding the whip," he joked, though his eyes remained serious. "Just remember, Mark can only make you feel small if you give him the ruler. Don't let him." They entered the ballroom together. The air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the sharp tang of champagne. Almost immediately, Elara felt the weight of eyes on her. She wasn't the cottage anymore. She was a silhouette of power.
Across the room, Mark was holding court near a fountain of carved ice. He was laughing, one arm wrapped tightly around Tiffany's waist as if she were a trophy he was afraid someone might steal. When he saw Elara, his laughter died mid-breath. His grip on his glass tightened so hard his knuckles turned white. Tiffany whispered something in his ear, her eyes flashing with malice. They began to weave through the crowd toward Elara and Liam. "Elara," Mark said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of the surrounding investors. "I'm surprised. I figured you'd be at home, perhaps cataloging books or whatever it is consultants do on a Saturday night." "I prefer to keep an eye on my investments, Mark," Elara replied, her voice cool and level. Tiffany stepped forward, looking Elara up and down with a sneer. "That's a lovely dress. It looks almost real. Tell me, did you use the company credit card for that, or did you find a very convincing thrift shop?" Liam stepped half a pace in front of Elara. "She's here as a guest of the firm, Tiffany. Maybe focus on your own drink before you spill it on that borrowed couture." Mark's face darkened. "Know your place, Hayes. You're a line drawer. And as for you, Elara, I've had enough of this charade. I spoke to the event security. We checked the guest list. There is no Elara Vance registered as a senior consultant for Apex." He signaled to two large men in dark suits, standing near the pillars. "I'm having you removed. It's bad enough you've been haunting my office, but trying to crash a private Apex function? That's a legal boundary you shouldn't have crossed." The crowd began to murmur. Elara felt the familiar sting of humiliation creeping up her neck, but then she felt Liam's hand move to the small of her back, a steadying, grounding presence. "Mark, don't do this," Elara said quietly. "It's going to be a mistake you can't undo." "The only mistake was not getting rid of you years ago," Mark hissed, leaning in close. "Security, please escort this woman. She's a disgruntled former associate who is trespassing." The security guards moved in, their expressions grim. One reached for Elara's arm. "Is there a problem here?" The voice was like a low roll of thunder. The crowd parted as a silver-haired man in a bespoke tuxedo approached. It was Arthur Henderson, the chief legal counsel for the Apex Group, followed by a phalanx of board members. Mark immediately straightened his tie, a sycophantic smile snapping into place. "Mr. Henderson, I'm so sorry for the disturbance. I was just taking care of a security breach. This woman—" He didn't even glance at Mark. He walked straight to Elara and bowed his head slightly in a gesture of profound respect. "Miss Vance," his voice carried through the silent hall, "I apologize for the delay. The board was reviewing the final audit of the Sterling Tech acquisition. We are ready for your instructions regarding the restructuring." The silence that followed was absolute. Mark's mouth hung open, his face draining of color until he looked like one of the marble statues lining the walls. Tiffany's hand dropped from Mark's arm, as if he'd suddenly become contagious. "Instructions," Mark stammered, his voice trembling. "Arthur, what are you talking about? She's a consultant. She's my ex." Henderson turned his gaze toward Mark, his eyes cold and clinical. "Mr. Sterling, you are mistaken. Elara Vance is not a consultant. She is the chairwoman of the Apex Group. She doesn't work for you. You and this entire hotel tonight work for her." Elara felt the shift in the room. It was as if the air itself had repolarized. The people who had been snickering moments ago were now looking at their shoes. "It's all right, Arthur," Elara said, her voice steady and clear. "Mr. Sterling was just leaving. He has a lot of work to do. After all, the skyscraper has some very serious foundation issues." She looked Mark directly in the eye. He looked small. For the first time in 5 years, he looked utterly, pathetically insignificant. "Wait," Mark whispered, stepping toward her, his voice trembling. "Elara, I didn't know. If I had known who you were—" "That's the point, Mark," she interrupted. "You should have cared who I was when you thought I was nobody." She turned away from him, her silk gown whispering against the floor. As she walked toward the balcony with Liam, she noticed Mark frantically pulled his phone out, ducking into a corner. He looked panicked, not just embarrassed, but hunted. She caught a glimpse of his screen as she passed. He was looking at a set of encrypted files, the black book ledgers she suspected existed. He was trying to delete something. "Liam," she whispered, leaning in close as they reached the balcony air, "the audit isn't enough. He's doing something much worse than being a bad boyfriend. He's trying to scrub the evidence of the embezzlement before the board meeting tomorrow." Liam looked at her, his gray eyes fierce. "Then let's stop him. You've got the power now, Elara. Use it." Elara looked out over the city lights, the white camellia in her hand. The cottage was gone. The storm is here.
The air in the Sterling Tech boardroom was so thick with tension it felt like a physical weight. The morning sun, usually a welcome visitor through the floor-to-ceiling windows, now acted like a cold spotlight, illuminating every bead of sweat on Mark's forehead. Mark sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his fingers drummed a frantic, uneven rhythm. Beside him, Tiffany sat stiffly, her designer handbag clutched in her lap like a shield. She had spent the morning trying to contact her father, but the board member had gone mysteriously silent. The door opened. Elara entered first, flanked by Arthur Henderson and a team of forensic auditors in somber suits. Liam followed a few steps behind, carrying a tablet and a stack of blueprints. He looked different today, not the exhausted scapegoat from the pit, but a man who finally saw a path forward. "Elara," Mark said, his voice cracking before he cleared his throat to regain a semblance of authority. "I think we can all agree the gala was a misunderstanding, a bit of theatrics, but we have a company to run. I've prepared a list of restructuring goals. We need to trim the dead weight to ensure the Sterling legacy remains intact." He gestured to the screen, where a list of names appeared. Liam's name was at the top, highlighted in red. "You're still talking about legacies," Elara said, taking her seat at the very head of the table, the seat Mark had occupied just seconds before. She didn't ask him to move. The sheer gravity of her presence forced him to scuttle to a side chair. "But you've forgotten that a legacy requires a foundation, and yours, Mark, is made of sand and stolen glass." "Now wait a minute," Mark began. "Elara," Elara said, ignoring him. "Arthur," Henderson stepped forward and opened a leather-bound folder. "During the final audit of the Sterling Tech acquisition, we discovered a series of ghost accounts. Over the last 18 months, $4 million was diverted from the R&D budget into a private holding company registered in the Cayman Islands. The owner of that company," Henderson paused, looking directly at Mark, "is a Mr. M. Sterling." The color drained from Mark's face, leaving it a sickly, translucent white. That's a mistake, a clerical error. I was setting those funds aside for a rainy day venture to benefit the firm." "A rainy day?" Elara leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Or was it the buy-in for your partnership with Vanguard Dynamics, the very company that happens to be the primary rival of Tiffany's father's firm?" Tiffany's head snapped toward Mark. "What? You told me you were helping my father's interests?" "I was," Mark stammered, reaching for her hand, but she pulled away as if he were covered in ash. "Tiffany, baby, I was doing it for us, so we could be independent of everyone." Elara slid a tablet across the table. It showed a series of encrypted messages retrieved from Mark's private server, the ones he had desperately tried to delete at the gala. "You weren't building a skyscraper, Mark. You were selling the blueprints of this building to the highest bidder while using my family's resources to keep the lights on. You didn't just underestimate me, you underestimated the very ethics of the industry you claim to lead."
Mark looked around the room. The other board members, men and women who had laughed at his jokes just days ago, were now looking at him with cold disgust. He was no longer a rising star, he was a liability. "You're fired, Mark," Elara said. The words were quiet, but they echoed like a gavel. "Effective immediately. Your shares are being frozen pending a criminal investigation into embezzlement and corporate espionage." "You can't do this," Mark screamed, standing up so abruptly his chair flipped backwards. "I built this. This name is on the front of the building." "The name on the building can be changed. The character of the person inside it cannot." Two security guards, the same ones Mark had tried to use to humiliate Elara at the gala, stepped into the room. They didn't hesitate. They gripped Mark by the arms. "Tiffany, help me," Mark pleaded as he was hauled toward the door. Tiffany Thorne stood up, smoothed her silk skirt, and looked at him with a chilling indifference. "My father always told me to never invest in a sinking ship, Mark. I think I've seen enough." She turned to Elara, a flicker of something, perhaps a newfound, terrifying respect in her eyes. "I'll have my things moved out of the penthouse by noon." She walked out without a backward glance, leaving Mark to be escorted out in a flurry of protests that eventually faded into the silence of the hallway. The room was quiet for a long moment. Elara let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for 5 years. The weight was gone. The cottage was no longer being crushed by the shadow of a false monument. She turned to Liam, who had been watching her with a quiet, steady pride. "Mr. Hayes, the Sterling Tower project is being renamed. From now on, it will be the Apex Meridian, and I believe the project needs a lead architect who understands that a building's beauty is nothing without its integrity. Are you interested?" Liam looked at the blueprints on the table, then back at her. He didn't look at her as a boss or a billionaire. He looked at her as the woman who had helped him fix the cantilever in the basement. "Only if the owner is willing to get her hands dirty on the site visits," Liam said with a grin. "I wouldn't have it any other way," Elara replied. Epilogue. 6 months later, Elara stood on the rooftop of the newly topped-out Meridian building. The wind whipped her hair, but she didn't tuck it away. She stood tall, looking out over the city. She wasn't the girl who stayed quiet to make a man feel loud. She wasn't the daughter hiding in the shadows of a family name. She was Elara Vance, a woman who had lost everything only to realize she already owned the world. Liam stepped up beside her, handing her a hard hat. He leaned against the railing, saying, "The foundation is solid, the strongest I've ever seen." Elara looked down at the bustling streets below, where somewhere Mark was likely still trying to explain away his past to anyone who would listen. She didn't feel anger anymore. She didn't even feel the need for further revenge. "It had to be," Elara said, reaching out to take Liam's hand, "because this time we're building something meant to last." The sun set over the horizon, painting the glass of the skyscraper in hues of gold and fire, a brilliant, unyielding reflection of the woman who owned it all.